All right. Good morning, everybody. Merry Christmas. Happy New Year. All that good stuff that goes along with all that. It's good to see you out. Those that are listening, we appreciate you listening with us this morning. Hope you got everything you asked for from Santa Claus. If you didn't, it's your fault. He always brings to good people. I always tell Dad that must have been my problem. But anyway, all right. We do have a lot out due to weather, some due to the holiday, some due to sickness. Do we know of anybody that we don't know about that we need to mention? Kind of hard to figure, like I say, with the weather and the holiday and everything else going on. But we've already FaceTimed Graceland. She's already FaceTimed us. And I really don't know what she got. I mean, because when a child wants to show you everything on a phone, she does like this. You don't see anything. But she had some sort of baby change table and where she could clean the baby. And Ethan said she's already broke it and her mom's fixed it, so it's all right. So, that's not bad. But she was a smiling, so that's all that mattered. And we'll get to spend some time with them in the next couple of days and have our Christmas together. That'll be good. And I hope you are able to sometime either before you've already done it or today or this week, you'll be able to spend some time with you folks. And that'll be good. We are going to begin a series of lessons in the auditorium class. We're beginning today on parables. And you have an outline there. And as I was rereading it last night, I realized that I evidently didn't proofread it when I typed it. I typed it and hit print. And so there's a couple of mistakes in it, but it's just grammatical mistakes. And so I'll point those that I called out last night, and I'll point them out to you so that you won't think I'm uneducated and pretty dumb. Which, anyway, yeah, well, no, it's have people think that you're not very smart, because then if you do something, they go, wow. But anyway, parables. What is a parable? That's where we want to begin. First thing, and the easiest way probably, is to define parables. What is a parable? Well, the word parable, the Greek word that's used in the New Testament, comes from the word parabolain, which literally means means beside of, and balain comes from another word, baleo, which means to throw. And so literally the word parable means to throw or to throw beside. It's the idea really of taking a story and placing it beside the truth in order to teach the truth. It's the Lord's illustrations. Now, back quite a few years ago, I had an individual tell me that they didn't like my stories and they wanted me to quit telling stories. And so they became my story. I said, well, why? Well, I don't like them. The Lord didn't use them. Did he ever teach in parables? Well, yeah. What's a parable? Well, I understand that, but it's a story. It's a story that illustrates the truth. And one of the things we'll see, one of the things that we'll talk about toward the end of this outline, and for time, and I kind of feel like we'll get started in one of the first parables I want to talk about in Matthew 13, the parable of the sower, but we won't be able to finish it today, is that when we look at a parable, we look at it with the idea of it illustrating the truth that the Lord is trying to teach. Now, there are Old Testament parables, and I'm toying with the idea of, after we've covered quite a few of the New Testament parables, looking at one or two of the Old Testament parables to show us some of the. When we talk about in general, we think of the ones Jesus used. And so that's kind of where I'm referring to this morning. When Jesus used and taught his parables, he didn't use his parables to teach a truth. He used them to illustrate. They were his stories to tell the truth or to illustrate the truth to the practical man so that he might understand it. And so Webster has an interesting definition. He calls the narrative, parable is a narrative or a story, by which something real in life is used and are placed alongside certain truths for the purpose of illustrating or conveying a spiritual truth. Now, that's a lot of words, but it's a good definition for what a parable is: a story to illustrate a truth or convey a spiritual truth. Some characteristics of a parable. They include, now that's where your grammar should have, or you could say characteristics of a parable include, not included, but include. It's a story. It doesn't always have to be a story where you talk about him and Bob and Sally and Sue and how they went to the store and what they did, because you think about the parable, say, of the dragnet. That's, it's just a simple illustrative thought that Jesus has to explain certain actions within the kingdom. But it is to say that oftentimes they are a story. People is not historical. Sometimes I tell, we Wednesday night we talked about the beautiful star of Bethlehem, the history, the historical about it. He didn't say one of the prophets and tell he did in the past and say, well, this is a parable. Secondly, very, very much. I've done it. Look at what you talk about. Story that Jesus told, his parables, were things that the common, everyday, ordinary man understood and understood. We're like, we have buses here and a few these services work downtown. We have Uber now. But talk about or use an illustration in this part of the world that's centered around boy. And you have been and seen, I have not. But the vast majority of people and the idea of boys. And most of the millennials that were raised in Nashville, never been around agriculture like I did growing up. And so stories, but Jesus used stories that to the people he was talking to, they understood what he was talking about. So it's not historical, true to life. The last of what we're including characteristics is the story is given to teach a truth. In other words, Jesus had a reason for saying what he said. He didn't just say it. It wasn't just a story just to make everybody go, oh, okay. It was a story that had a truth. What were the purposes? I've said Jesus usage of parables. What was the purpose of Jesus using? Well, first of all, is project the truth, to make spiritual truths clear. If you have your Bibles, look in Matthew chapter 18. I'm not going to get into all of this because this is one of the parables I do want to talk about later on. But I do want you to see it Beginning in Matthew 18:21, Peter came to him and said, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? Up to 7 times? Jesus said, do not say to you up to 7 times, but 70 times 7. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a certain king. See, he begins the story. A certain king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. And when he had begun to settle accounts, one was brought to him, who owed him 10,000 talents. And he goes forth, and it's the story of the unmerciful servant. Remember the man that basically, parable, just to remind you very quickly, here's a servant owed his master a tremendous sum of money. This master was going to sell him. He begged for mercy. The master, he went out and found a fellow servant that owed him very little. He had him thrown in debtor's prison. He wanted, him to pay what he owed him. And the master comes back and he says, you should have been what was done to you. Now, like I say, I want this parable later on. But it is to say that Jesus taught and projected the truth. He made the spiritual truth clear. He said, he began by saying, don't say till you forgive 7 times, but unto 70 times 7. And then he illustrated the point. So his parable illustration. Secondly, not only was it project the truth, it was protect the truth. Conceal the truth from the dishonest, who were eager to abuse and twist the scriptures. In Matthew 13, right in the middle of the parable of the sower, Matthew gives the purpose for the parables. And Jesus sort of outlines it, if you will, that why he spoke in parables. He begins in verse 13, Matthew 13. He says, therefore, I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. And in them the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled, which says, and he talks about the prophecy of Isaiah, which basically said, seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, and they don't understand. When we look at that, and we sometimes want to fudge or figure out what is Jesus saying, and what is he trying to say? Well, there are, first of all, people that don't want to hear the truth. There are also people that hear the truth, but hear it with the purpose of twisting it. Hear it with the purpose of perverting it. Hear it with the purpose of changing it. And Jesus wanted to make sure that the spiritual man, the man that was in tune to what he was trying to teach, they understood. Now, one of the things that, kind of a sidelight right here, but one of the things that I guess in the last 10 years I've been more and more aware of, and seemingly I'm more and more aware each day, is the millennials do not understand what I'm going to term, and this, haven't read this term before, church talk. In other words, go talk to, say, a 25, 30-year-old individual and talk about Jesus being your propitiation, Jesus being the one that reconciles you, Jesus being your advocate. They have no clue. Why? They don't use those terms. Those are not terms that they use on an everyday basis. And so while we that have been in the church for years understand and appreciate and are thankful for all of those things, they don't associate that with anything. Well, we need to be careful in the church. That's why a lot of times when I start using those terms, and I call them $64,000 terms. Why? Because I think that's what my dad said, for one. But it's those terms that, you've got to think about. Jesus was talking to people that didn't have spiritual clue either. And he wanted to make sure that they understood the truth as it was. And so he used parables. Next, and I'm fixing to open this up, by the way, for questions and comments. Next, Jesus used to persuade men of the truth. He wanted to cause men to assent or to agree to the truth before they maybe even realize that it even applied to them. Look in Matthew 21. Look beginning in verse 33. You have a parable there. There's a certain land, wine press in it, and built a tower. And he leased it to the vine dresser. Went into a vintage time drew near. He sent the servants of vine dressers that they might receive his fruit. Vine dressers took his servants. I'm going to stop right there because, like I say, this too is another parable. Anyways, when you think about what Jesus is teaching here and you look at it and you analyze it, what's Jesus talking about? His own death, right? They weren't going to listen to him because he sins. Because you remember, the owner sends his son, kill him too. Jesus is talking about the prophets, those that were before. They killed them. They did all terrible things to him. Sent son. I'm the son. They're going to kill me. Jesus basically is getting those people because there were probably people listening in that audience. Yep, got it. Understand? Yep. I remember something like that. I probably have seen something like that, or I can imagine that being done by ruthless people in my day. And so therefore, yeah. And then all of a sudden they're smacked with reality. That was Jesus. Jesus was talking about his own day. And so he persuaded them of the truth, and sometimes even before they ever realized what they were agreeing to. And then next, Jesus used parables to put into the memory of individuals. And in other words, it becomes easy to remember stories and everyday applications. We may remember the story of the Good Samaritan more than we understand the principle or the application of it, or the prodigal son and the application of it. We remember stories. Ron Rose, many years ago, wrote a book entitled 7 Things Your Children Will Remember. And one of the things, not of the 7, but one of the things that he said that really stuck with me out of the book was this: kids will remember stories. And that's true, isn't it? And we've made life events that occurred to us and occurred with us into stories, right? Have you told a story within the last, say, week about what you did at Christmas as a kid? About what your mom and dad used to do Christmas when you were a kid? Or when your kids were growing up, what you did? We've all done that, been there, done that. Remember stories. And Jesus' principle, let's say, with the idea of the unmerciful servant that we used a while ago, he could have forgiven one another. That's a principle. That principle may or may not be remembered, but they understand and remember the story, and then they take and say, the principle is forgiveness. And so Jesus used a parable for people to memorize or to understand and to know what he's trying to teach and remember. Anything I'd like to say? Yes, yes, yes. That reminded me of a joke. You've heard the one about the guy that was in jail and he's nervous. He wasn't supposed to be in jail. He was had money and so forth and so on, and he never thought he'd break the law. And so he went to the guy that had been in jail the longest, and he said, I never expected my whole life to be here, and I shouldn't be here, and I'm nervous and I don't know what to do. And the old man said, well, just stay with me and watch and listen. So they went out to the courtyard for exercise, and somebody standing around said 33, and everybody started to laugh. And they said, and in a minute they said, 65. Everybody started to laugh. They did one or two others, and finally the guy, he was beginning to feel comfortable. And he said, 18. Nobody laughed. So when they got off themselves, the old man and the man that was so nervous, he said, I don't understand. He said, y'all were just throwing out numbers and laughing. And he said, I threw out a number, he didn't laugh. He said, what's the deal? He said, well, son, you got to understand. The numbers are jokes. And he said, we've all been in here so long, we don't have to tell the joke again. We just got them numbered, and we remember which joke they are when we call out the numbers. He said, but they didn't laugh when I called out a number. He said, some people just can't tell a joke. So, just bad stories. They happen a lot in my house. Suzanne just looks at me, shakes her head, walks off. Anything else? That's good though, Jay. I would remember that. I'll walk in Jay's house. 12. Anything else? "12." I like that one. That's funny. That's funny. Because certainly didn't go where I was projecting it to go. Oh, yeah. Should be in help understand parables. I'm sorry for these mistakes. I don't know why I didn't proofread. Anyway, I did. Yeah, help is understanding the parables. Well, let's talk. Some of these are. Think about some of these things. When we began to study the parables, there are certain things that will help us understanding and help us in interpreting. Hopefully, what I'm planning on doing is I'm not going to cover all of Jesus' parables. I'll show you in a minute. Matter of fact, I have this in outline form if anybody's interested. Really, the parables can be broken down into kingdom parables. And this is, by the way, this is from a book by Wayne Jackson, who departed from this world the last year or two. Wayne Jackson, he spent his last few years in Jackson, Tennessee, living in Jackson, Tennessee with one of his children. But Wayne was in Stockton, California for years, and he wrote prolifically for the church. He was a really good, faithful preacher. I was able to hear him several times at Fred Hardeman's lectureships. He didn't really come back this way and hold meetings or anything. He wrote a lot of books and he had a monthly publication at one time that I received, and he impressed me because I wrote him a note. I ordered a book from him and wrote him a note, and he wrote me a note back. And I know he was extremely busy, but he took the time to write me a note, so I appreciate that. But in his book on parables, he divided them this way, and I've always liked this division of parables. He's kingdom parables. That's the biggest chunk of parables. Sinner parables, forgiveness parables, prayer parables, stewardship parables, service parable, really the only one, the Good Samaritan, as he broke them down, and preparation parables. And I'll kind of, if you want one, you can have one of these, and I'll talk about those as we break them down a little bit later. But like parables, all these different principles. Well, what are some helps though in understanding the parables? First of all, study the story as a story until you get the glimpse of its meaning in that day. Study the story as a story. Like I said, don't study it as a truth to be taught, but as an illustration of the truth that is taught or was taught. Secondly, study the story with strict regard to the author's interpretation and application. In other words, let the author tell the story. Let the author make the point. Of course, that's God, but you could say God, but that's whoever's telling the story. Don't try to make the point yourself. And this comes to play a little later on in some of these. Thirdly, study the story with strict regard and setting of the context and the theme of the passage. What is trying to be said? What is being said? What is trying to be said here in that time frame? When I was in both undergraduate and graduate, one of the things that a lot of my teachers tried to illustrate, and I like the illustration real well, is they talked about they'd take their glasses off and they talk about putting on first century glasses. In other words, read a story within the time frame of which it was written and interpret it within the time frame of which it's written. Don't try to fit, say, the parable of the sower. Don't try to make it fit what's going on today. Let the Lord speak to you and try instead of you speaking to the Lord. And so many people are going in the wrong direction, interpreting parables or any of the Bible. Next, D, determine the basic purpose of the parable by studying the context. Good Samaritan would be a good one. Next, E, find the one central teaching of the parable. What's the one thing it's trying to teach? What's the parable saying? What's it trying to teach? What's the one? Now, it will have other little principles, but what's the one overriding theme? And I'll show you as we get into these parables here in the next few weeks. I'll show you what I mean by all that. F, the language and teachings of the parables must not be pressed beyond its intended design. In other words, don't make it say something that it doesn't say. One of the things that you don't hear it too much really in Bible school, but when I began to read books and began to listen to preachers online, especially preachers that I don't always agree with, but sometimes I get some good thoughts from, is that they take a parable, they take it first of all outside of its time context and try to make it today's parable. But not only that, but then they take it and they abuse it really by making it fit what they want to teach. Now, you can take a story, you can take a human interest story, stories like I tell. You can take a human interest story, and it might illustrate 2 or 3 different things. But a parable is really meant to illustrate truly just one thing. Like I said, we may find, and we will, as we study these parables, we will find that there are little lessons in throughout, but there's still one central theme, and we've got to allow that to be taught. No point of doctrine should be derived from a parable that's not clearly taught elsewhere. The parables are doctrine. I already said that, just said that. That's the point I want you to get there. Not try to tack a meaning onto every element. In other words, don't try to make every little person, every little thing that they do mean something. You know, there are times when we do scratch our nose. It doesn't mean anything, right? Those true in parables. Things are told, things are said to help get the picture, but it's not trying to teach you a principle with regards to the lesson that's being taught. Next, sometimes parables are trying to deal with men as they viewed themselves and not as they really were. Go back in Luke 15, you talk about the story of the lost sheep, the lost. Sometimes parables were designed to deal with men as they saw themselves. And we see ourselves differently than we see others. Give you a point of illustration. Go talk to somebody about coming to church. Yeah, I'd like to go to church. Where do you go to church? Huh? Church of Christ. River Road Church of Christ. Church of Christ. You people think y'all the only ones going to heaven. The best way that I know to answer that, and still in a loving way, is, well, don't you think you're going to heaven? Well, yeah. Well, who doesn't? I was flipping through Facebook this morning, and there's an individual that I'm going to let the Lord judge some of his family, but I know some of them that have passed away. And if the Bible is right, and I believe that it is, and like I say, I'm going to let God judge them. But but he wished all of them a Merry Christmas in heaven. All my loved ones that have passed away, a Merry Christmas in heaven. Well, hold to that hope, brother, because we all are. But, and like I say, I'm going to let God judge them. And if they're all there, I'll be thankful. What is it? The guy said, he said, I forgot now the exact story. But if I get to heaven, he said, first, there'll be 3 surprises, and I'm not going to tell this right. He said, I'll be surprised that I'm there. I'll be surprised because some aren't there. But he said, I'll also be surprised that some are there. So, but sometimes we don't really see ourselves as we really are. And so parables sometimes help. Next, when you're studying parables, remember their timelessness and their timeliness. In other words, they are stories fit for that day, but they still ring true today if you study them. So parables are a great source of strength, a great source of teaching, and they teach us and are often remembered more than the principles that are taught in other scriptures. Anything anybody like to say, right? All right. Well, I thought I'd go through that faster, but I'm long. Matthew 13. I'm not going to have time to get into all this, but I want to make a couple of points here and save this parable for next. Some weeks we will study more than one parable, and that will be our intent. Some weeks we will just study one parable. We'll just do this for a few weeks and see how it goes. And I don't necessarily have just, this is the number of weeks we're going to cover parables, but it's 3 studies. I want us to begin, though, by talking about the parable of the sower. And I want you to think about some things. One is that Jesus doesn't spend a lot of time interpreting the stories, the parables that he told. But he does the parable of the sower. Now you might say, well, why is that? Well, there could be several different reasons. There could be the fact that he's asked in this point. Well, was he asked at other times when he taught to explain the parables? Could have been. But we don't have those interpretations. We don't have those parts of the stories. And so that's a possibility. It could have been the fact that Jesus didn't need to illustrate the parable. The people were getting it. One of the things that as a teacher and as a preacher, when you're preaching, you kind of get a sense of if people are getting what you're trying to say. And sometimes you get a sense that they're not. Well, maybe it was due to that. I don't really know the answer, but I do know that it's kind of fascinating to think about the fact that in this parable, Jesus really gives an understanding of what he's trying to say. What's the context? Context, if you go back in Matthew chapter 12, if you look in verse 22, it says, they brought to him one who was demon-possessed, blind and mute, and he healed him, so that the blind and the mute man both spoke and saw. And so Jesus heals this man. And what happens if you go then verse 23, it says, all the multitudes were amazed and said, could this be the son of David? In other words, they were amazed and they began to ask questions. That's the best time to teach people, is when they are asking the questions. Now, sometimes we have to prick their interest, and sometimes we have to say or do things that will get them to asking questions. But it's a good time to teach. It's sort of like there's always been, and especially within the last, 10, 15 years, maybe to my thinking, than ever before. And that was What do we in the Church of Christ do with Christmas? What do we do with it? 30, 40 years ago, like Jim has told us many different times, the good brother that told him, don't lead that song. We're going to stay away from Christmas. Brother Hugh Fulford writes a weekly dissertation almost, but this week it was on, what to do with Christmas. And Brother Hughes, he's basically retired now. Gospel preacher, faithful gospel preacher, preached, I don't know, many, many different sermons. I guess around here, maybe if you were to connect him with anybody, it'd be Shelbyville. He stayed in Shelbyville for quite a while. He was one of those guys, still is one of those guys. He loves a joke. He loves to tell a story. Loves the truth. But he talked about the different sermons that he has preached in and around Christmas. And the point that he was making is a point that I really feel, and that is that we need to take this opportunity while we understand that Christmas is not the birthday of Christ. One of Martin Luther King Jr.'s daughters was on a show I had on this morning, and she made a statement. She said, we know Christmas is not the birthday of Christ because Christ was born in spring, which is probably more true than anything. We don't know when he was born. And the fact is, the Bible doesn't tell us to remember his birthday. But as some have said, if you don't have his birth, you can't have his death. And there's very much truth in that. I don't always preach on Matthew 1 or Luke chapter 2 in and around Christmas. Why? Because, the old story is now that how come you people only preach on the resurrection of Jesus Christ and his birth? Well, if you'd come to others than Easter and Christmas, you'd hear different sermons. But it is to say that we've probably missed the boat on not talking about those things at this time of the year. Why? Because that's what is in tune with most people's thinking. And so here in Matthew 12, these people were amazed, and it was just a good time to talk to them. And so you keep reading in Matthew chapter 12, you see that the Pharisees began to press Jesus. And one of the things they do, if you go down to verse 38, is, teacher, we want to see a sign from you. We want to know that you're really Jesus. We fought, F-A-U-L-T, we fought the Pharisees a lot. But they can't help the fact that they were born in Missouri. Show me. In other words, they wanted folks to, they wanted to see, they wanted to understand. Now, they were afraid of losing their power, they were afraid of losing their prestige, they were afraid of losing their place, but they were also afraid of the fact that Jesus was just another false teacher. They want to see a sign. And so Jesus rebukes them, beginning in verse 39. He says, "In the adulterous generation seek after a sign. No sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah." And he goes to explain that. Well, then jump on to verse 36. While he was still talking to the multitude, behold, his mother and brother stood outside seeking to speak to him. And one said, "Look, your mother and your brothers are standing outside seeking to speak with you." And Jesus laid down a tremendous principle. And really, the principle is family. Church is a family. And he says that who's my brother, my Father in heaven is my brother, the same as my brother and my sister and my mother. And so he teaches them. Now, keep reading. On the same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat by the sea. And great multitudes were gathered together to him, so that he got into a boat, and the whole multitude stood on the shore. Then he spoke many things to them in parables, saying, I may miss the boat on this, but it is interesting what Matthew says here, that he spoke many things to them. I think that Jesus spoke more than just the parable of the sower that day. And matter of fact, more than maybe what's just found in Matthew 13. Jesus spoke many things to them. But notice what it says. It says that he spoke many things to them in parables, plural. So you might say, well, what about this? I think there's 7 parables here. What about all these parables? Were they all preached at one time? Probably so. One upon another, probably so. Matthew did have a tendency in his account of the gospel to group things together. Matthew did have, and if you go back, say compare Matthew to Luke, and this is the point we'll try to make with this. When you compare Matthew with Luke, Matthew has a Sermon on the Mount, right? Starts off with the Beatitudes, goes then through the idea of the light and leaven influence, and again, he ventures into this prayer, and actually chapter 5, he ventures into you've heard it's been said, but I say unto you, and then he goes into prayer in chapter 6, and the general outline. But if you look in Luke's account, those verses are scattered throughout Luke. They're not just in one place. Time. I appreciate that. Because if he'd done this and gone ding, I'd have thought something was really wrong. Thank you. I was hoping you was keeping track of that. I appreciate it. I really do very much. But Jesus, or rather Luke, scatters those verses throughout. And so when you look at Matthew, you see several times where he groups things together that are spread out, say, through Matthew's account or Mark's account or John's account or through Luke's account. And you say, well, what's the reason? What's the difference? Matthew that's just sort of, he might have had a little bit of OCD. But I think Matthew has 5 sermons in it. And I think Jesus preached those sermons. Are they complete? I don't know. In other words, did Matthew record everything that Jesus said in those sermons? I don't know. Sermon on the Mount, is that everything? I don't know. But I do think it's a sermon. So Jesus now is going to speak in parables. And I'm going to stop right there because that's a good place to stop. We got people coming in. Anything anybody like to say or add? Yes. Yeah. It's where they were, not only where they were, but who they were talking to, and the message, the purpose for the writing. Yeah. Very true. Very good. Very good. I'm glad you said that. Very good. Anything else? Okay, so next week the plan is just to look at the parable of the sower. You want to go on and study it. And I may throw in Mark's account and Luke's account, but we'll probably just stick with Matthew's account for the most part, just so we don't get too confused. But like I said, I may throw in some of the other just a little bit. But I've never, in sitting in a class when you're having to bump back and forth, just you lose something. You don't have, I ain't got 3 fingers to hold it and go back. I was listening to a good friend of mine preach the other day, and he was preaching on, he was really preaching on Luke chapter 10, but he was throwing in Matthew's account and Mark's account, and it got confusing. And he didn't get confused, which was good, but it got confusing listening to him. So I'm just that way. Anything else? Let's bow right quick for a word of prayer. Father in heaven, thank you for this day, for the many blessings. Thank you for our opportunity to study your word, to get the things that are needful and helpful. As we begin this study of parables, we ask that our eyes will be open, our minds will be open to gaining those truths that are taught in those parables, and so that we might be better servants of yours. We ask that you be with us all today. Some are sick and some just did not feel comfortable getting out in this weather, and we understand all that, and we ask that you bless them and keep them. Those that are out traveling, we ask that you watch over them, that you bless them and keep them. We ask now that you watch over us, bless us, and keep us and hold us as we hold to you. For this is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. Y'all have a great day.